The Minister of Finance and Coordinating Minister of the Economy, Wale Edun, has presented the Accelerated Stabilization and Advancement Plan, Escap, designed to address key challenges affecting the reform initiatives and stimulate development in various sectors of the economy. The presentation of the Stabilization Plan to the President occurred about 48 hours after Edun said a stabilization package was underway in response to a question on the recent exit of some multinationals from Nigeria. However, in what appears to be the first official acknowledgement that the government has continued subsidizing premium motor spirit, PMS, popularly known as petrol, the new plan revealed that government is still supporting downstream consumption. The plan further noted, and I quote, at current rates, expenditure on fuel subsidy is projected to reach 5.4 trillion by the end of 2024. This compares unfavorably with 3.6 trillion in 2023 and 2.03 trillion in 2022. Meanwhile, the House of Representatives has urged the federal government to redirect the focus from fixing a new minimum wage to fixing a realistic living wage for Nigerians in its negotiations with the labor unions. They also urged the government to consider further the downward review of electricity tariffs to reduce the suffering of Nigerians.
Note that the implications of payment of 35,000 wage award by the federal government to public servants as one of the ways of cushioning the effect of current economic hardship, including the May 1st pronouncement of percentage increase in salaries of civil servants, has for the time being increased the total amount received by civil servants to 77,000 naira monthly.
Has to look at section 16 2D of Nigerian Constitution. It says that suitable and adequate shelter, suitable and adequate food, reasonable and national minimum living wage shall be provided for the Nigerian worker.
I will urge this House to please, with the speed with which we pass the national anthem, that we should also recall the Minimum Wage Act, reconsider it, and with that same speed, pass that act and ensure that we give the Nigerian worker a living wage in that act.
First is welfare, security. This is what is enshrined in the Constitution. And so I want to align myself with those who are of the opinion that this matter should be resolved as quickly as possible through every other means to ensure that we have a peaceful nation.
Joining us now on the morning show is Esili Eigbe, an economist and director, Escap Management. Good morning, Mr. Eigbe, and thank you very much for joining us. Well, very quickly, quite a cocktail of issues there, from the plan by Wale Edun, Minister of Finance, to Labor, to other plans. But let's start with this disclosure by Mr. Wale Edun in his stabilization plan, that Nigeria has in fact been paying subsidy. And that in fact by the end of that year, that subsidy will be up to 5.4 billion. Trillion. Okay, trillion. So government has been selling us a lie. Because this was an issue. Economists were saying, no, the federal government of Nigeria is still paying subsidy on fuel consumption at the downstream level. And government kept saying, no, subsidy is gone. Subsidy is gone. The same way national anthem is gone. Only to discover now that this year alone, we're going to pay more on fuel consumption than we did in 2022 and that we did in 2023. What is the punishment for a government that lies to its people? Let's start with that.
I think that it's probably impossible that that miscommunication came from the Ministry of the Ministry of Finance. I think that it might have been other maybe parts of the government, perhaps the National Assembly, that might have been pushing the case for the government not carrying subsidy. I think everybody in the country, majority of Nigerians, agreed and believed that the government was still subsidizing petroleum products, PMS to be specific. I think it was mostly in the international community that belief that subsidy was removed exists. I still get a lot of calls from internationals who are still praising the government on, removing PMS subsidies. In fact, I think if you follow the IMF, World Bank's updates on Nigerian economy in April, they still suggested that there were significant reforms in removal of subsidies, fuel subsidies.
All right. Okay. So let me talk about this plan because it's very detailed, and I think for the first time, as Dr. Abati had mentioned, a few truths or some things were clarified, and finally the government is facing the fact on the ground. Some of the challenges that they've identified would be the macroeconomic environment, and I think it's clear to see. It's something we've talked about a number of times, and how this impacts on businesses as well. So before we talk about interventions, I'd like you to just speak to the persistent high inflation, which despite the CBN raising basis points, hasn't quite been able to tame inflation, and of course the attendant effect on interest rates, particularly for businesses and being able to borrow. Do you think that so far the CBN's intervention in taming inflation is the most effective route to take? What other things ought to be done if you think otherwise?
To answer you, perhaps pick up from your last question, I think that it's been the most effective. And as I have said, on your program a number of times, where we're significantly lacking is fiscal, action with respect to tackling inflation. Yes. So addressing things like insecurity, which have contributed significantly to food inflation. It appears that in the new document that the Ministry of Finance released, they're obviously putting up plans to kind of boost agricultural output. That will help a lot to addressing those problems. And here is clearly the fiscal reforms that we've been talking about. So clearly this has come on the back of pressure for the fiscal side to do something. But you're still going to see or continue to see, the increase in NPR, central bank rates remaining the single, I think, most significant, impacting factor on inflation.
Let me ask you quickly. I'm glad you say that this is probably responding to pressure. We've been calling for the fact that the monetary side of things seems to be on the right path, but there's no corresponding fiscal response. I know that the best time to do anything, even though it's late, is now. It's but when should this plan have come out? Because we talked about this yesterday when we first mentioned it, that we're quite taken aback that we're just getting this plan about 1 year after.
The inauguration of that administration should have been introduced.
You can say that the ministers came a few months afterwards, but would you have expected this plan to have come out? Because this is just this is the first step before we begin to go through the process of implementation, getting it right, executive orders and the likes. I'd like you to speak to that.
It's late. It's kind of late in the game, but I think that hopefully it will complement the monetary policies and address the inflation issue. But like I've said, it's not going to be an overnight job. It will take years, possibly the end of the medium term, to arrest inflation. I think that a lot of businesses, households have come to expect inflation. And so you will likely continue to see that rise. It might continue to do so, maybe peaking in somewhere around August. My assessment of sort of food products, even in the month of May.
So brace yourself.
In the month of May, showed that a lot of food products continue to rise. Tomato, for example, has just totally eclipsed. So this is a big issue. On average, if you look or comparing April 2024 to sort of April 2022, food prices on average have risen over 200%, or about 200%.
Okay, so I read the 65-page document when I got a hand on it. Pretty much still reminds me of glossy documents.
Yeah.
Why? Because these are things we all know before.
Yeah.
If you were to juxtapose the plan of President Tinubu mid last year when he said there was going to be a freeze, on subsidy, and I think that was an indication that we're going to continue to pay subsidies. So he had announced it last year, and I kept on referring to that point because he said in mid-year. That was also the time he talked about 100,000 hectares cultivation per state, agricultural input, 50 billion, some single-digit interest for manufacturing sector, for SMEs and everything. These were all the things that rehatched in the 65-page document. Probably in gas, what they also talked about was the fact that, okay, we've got potential for gas, we've not really increased it. How are we going to increase it? Ensure we finish the OBD2 pipeline, the AKK pipeline. I mean, we all know these things. The question is, can we have a better creative thinking than what we already know? What is thinking out of the box to an average Nigerian?
So I don't think it's a thinking aspect, or we're void of plans. We have a lot of great plans on paper already. It seems to me like where the challenge has been is being political will and just execution. Perhaps releasing this document is perhaps a testament to the fact that they're willing to now come into execution. But we'll have to see. You made a very good point that these are not new ideas. They've been rehashed, and so what I think we as Nigerians would like to see is their final implementation.
So how do we implement? And I also want to quickly ask you a question about interest rates. We had an economist here that was sitting on the same seat you were talking about. He said probably we've gotten to in their day at some point that we shouldn't push up interest rates at this point in time. We should work more on the fiscal side. He understands the concept of the real rate of return, but he says for developmental economy, that analogy might not be sustainable. At a time we're having a stagflation, low growth climate.
We're in a situation where you have to decide between pursuing growth or tackling inflation. Given how high inflation is, you unfortunately have to choose one. And I think, as the central bank governor has said, the most prudent position to take is tackling inflation. Because if you allow inflation to continue to go, you end up in spiral inflation.
But the rate rises have not been tackling inflation. When the numbers come out every month, we still see that volatility with food, which is the fiscal side.
It doesn't happen overnight. It takes months, okay? As I had highlighted before, the US government, for example, has been trying to tackle inflation since January of 2022. It's still a big problem for them today. They haven't reached their target of 2%. So it takes months and years.
Britain got somewhere between from Rishi Sunak 11%.
We've only started raising rates since March.
Eigbe, this accelerated stabilization plan, ESAP, advancement plan, as they call it, is still at the level of proposal. What the Ministry of Finance or Minister of Finance has done is to make a proposal to the federal government. Tinubu is going to look at it. It will still be fine-tuned. There will be other inputs. So it's not as if it's a done deal. We should not talk about it as if it's a final document.
This is correct.
However, in that particular document, Wale Edun as Minister of Finance is making a lot of proposals, what he calls remedial plans to address issues of development, challenges faced with the reform initiatives. Now, what's your assessment of some of those remedial plans? I'll just cite one or two. One of it is this plan to provide stabilization fund for manufacturing companies and also for MSMEs. Now, the MSMEs will get, I think, 1 million at 9%. The bigger, large enterprises, which is the phrase used in the document, will get about 1 billion at 9%. Now, they are also talking about the oil sector, because there are 8 committees to link with the 8 priority areas of the administration. They are saying that with the oil and gas sector, Wale Edun is proposing that, look, government needs to work on financial decisions, investment decisions, FIDs, between 2024 and 2026. Signature bonuses have to be reviewed. So these are some of the remedial plans that are being proposed at a macroeconomic level in that particular document. What do you think? Do you think those remedial plans go far enough? And do you think Tinubu should take the document as is and come up with an executive order?
Yes, I mean, look, I haven't had the chance to go through the detailed document. I've just gone through it, on the face, and I mean, I do agree with a number of points that have been raised. Even some of the things you mentioned, I think, would definitely help to stimulate growth. But I think what was lacking in that document was, an elaborate plan to significantly increase government revenue. Nigeria is at the fiscal cliff. We cannot continue to depend on borrowing. You talked about subsidy on PMS. That alone, announcing that the indeed government is funding or potentially could fund to the tune of 5.4 trillion. What that's even telling you is that we should be looking at somewhere around 6 trillion. Okay, that alone is about 2% 2% of our GDP, additional 2% deficit on our GDP, on top of the perhaps approximate 5% that's based on the deficit that was announced on the 2024 budget, which didn't include the subsidy on PMS. So we need an elaborate plan on how government intends to increase its revenues. Nigeria today...
Tax. So Edele is already talking about tax, VAT.
Yes, I know that. I know that there are ongoing
so we'll all be taxed out of existence.
Reforms going on. But I'll say that where the government has seen a significant decline in revenues has been on oil output. And if you look at the budget for 2024, they're projecting about 1.8, almost 1.8 per day oil production, which we haven't been close to. So I'll say average for the year would probably be around 1.3, 1.4. So there's a very big deficit that we're seeing somewhere down the line, and the idea of just continuously funding it with debt. Nigeria is currently over 100 trillion in debt, both federal and state. 90% of that is held by the federal government.
100 trillion.
Over 100 trillion.
Debt.
Over 100 trillion.
Go 5, 7, 9 children will pay out on that debt.
And growing. And growing.
100 trillion.
I say amen.
So you have grandchildren.
Yeah.
That's what amen is for.
We've been taxed out of existence.
Yes.
Almost half of that, actually more than half of that is foreign debt, external debt. So given the devaluation in the currency, I mean, we're looking at a very, very serious issue here. And like I said again, government revenue. I want to see more about how government plans to boost revenue.
In all fairness, they put it in they talked about gas. I asked a question.
I was going to say, talking about government revenue, I talked about the openness or perhaps how fact-based this document is in terms of being real. For the first time, we see there that they talk about one of the challenges of achieving some of these plans is the restrictions on revenue or how low our revenue is.
Yes.
And they actually already put out a warning that we're already not meeting. In the first quarter, we met only 60% of projected revenue because of low production in oil, like you mentioned. Do you think it's time for us to be realistic with ourselves? All this 1.8 BPD, we're going to get to, it's not realistic. And so we should begin to think of means, actual means to raise our revenue, because we can have a grand plan. And if the only way we're looking to fund this grand plan in terms of an economic stability is to borrow, then I don't know. I don't know if that is viable, if that is wise in terms of spendings. But let me now go to the very particular things that they address. I know you said you haven't read the document, but I'll share some few things they said and to get your opinion on this. I've talked about social safety nets a number of times, especially in the interim, because like you rightly said, we're not going to see these changes happen overnight. But in the meantime, we have to protect the people and ensure that they don't fall off. Yeah. So they said they're going to restart the National Social Investment Program and talked about a more efficient way of doing this through biometrics. This has been spoken about since last year. I don't know what your take is on conditional transfer of cash to the most vulnerable. They talk about investment in the IDICE, that is the digital and creative enterprises for 2 million youths by 2027. Maybe the first question I ask is it even realistic? Would you be able to do that? And then number two, what your take on that is. And then unemployment program, monthly stipend. So some welfarist models there or policies there. What's your take on this? Do you think that would help cushion the effect whilst,
Of course. As I said again on your program, I think those direct transfers are important. Especially if you're deciding to take off subsidies on some of the, some of the costs that a lot of households already incur. You do need to implement plans like that, and it's stuff that we see everywhere in the world. A lot of advanced countries implement programs like this. But I think it'll depend a lot on government funding. We're at the fiscal cliff. I don't know, I'm starting to sound like a broken record, but as you pointed out rightly, they've only achieved 6% of the revenue targets that they set. If you had said that you're going to receive, the bulk of your oil revenue on the basis of a 1.8 million per day production, and you've only been producing an average of 1.2. I mean, that's serious. Yeah. So some of these plans you're talking about, they're cash-based. How do you fund that? Yeah. And you're still funding some of the other issues. We have also on the table increasing minimum wage.
Yeah. So very quickly, having said all these things, do you think the social net, the social safety net plan is sufficient, or are there additional things to look at in terms of
addressing,
yes, of addressing
how we manage the vulnerable?
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
I think it's a start. I was very happy to hear that.
Because this is a proposal, so they might take some of your recommendations to include in the review.
That. I think it's a start, and I was glad to see that they've put in some digital processes to try and get it done properly. So we'll have to see how that's implemented, because again, we can really talk about really brilliant ideas, but it's only in the implementation that you see these things. But those are the type of, I would say, social safety net programs that I'd like to see, where you can track, how perhaps some of those your reliefs are perhaps helping the household. But I think even very important as well is the issue about minimum wage. And I excuse me because we keep using the word minimum wage, but we don't talk about just wages generally in the civil service. That's very poor. We need to even talk about pensions. There are a lot of, I think so far only 5 states are fully compliant with pension laws. So these are things that we need to discuss, even way beyond the issue of direct transfers, to the poorest in the society. Our civil service households are amongst the poorest in our society. I mean, if you're saying that minimum wage today is 30 and you want to take to 60 naira per month, that's not sustainable.
How much is sustainable?
That's a very good question, but I don't think I have an answer for you. But I know it's not 100,000.
Okay.
It might not be even 200,000.
Okay.
And I'm not saying that you do this immediately. You can phase it, especially because of its implication on inflation. But these are things that the government needs to seriously take.
Okay, so a couple of things. In all fairness, they talked about gas, that we have so much potential, we're not using it, but we know that also comes with massive investment. They're targeting 2 million barrels per day. And in all fairness, probably with their MSME scheme, they could bring back programs like You Win, and also with their conditional cash transfer, they could also tie to outcomes. Because why conditional cash transfer has worked with Brazil as a model is because it was tied to outcomes. So it's not just people collecting the money, they must be able to go to school, we must see a trajectory. And we saw those people come back many years after. And these were the ones that voted Lula in the second time. The point I want to make, let's talk about the finances. Budget 28 trillion as we speak. The projected deficit was 9 trillion.
Actually, 29 trillion.
29
because if you
trillion.
add the National Assembly members, they added about 1.2 trillion. So that came to about almost
29 trillion. The
29,
deficit, 9-10 trillion. But the interesting part of that deficit is that we might not be able to even get the 19 trillion we're talking about to fund the budget, because we've fallen back on our revenue projection.
It's impossible.
So that means we have to borrow more. And at the same time, the president recently told the National Assembly that we're going to have a supplementary budget to add to it. I mean,
they have to, because that's the subsidy of petroleum products isn't included in that budget.
Vis-a-vis also the fact that businesses lost about 100% of their value in forex problems. That's why you see all the top multinationals are struggling today. So the question I'd like to ask you is, what will be the quick buffers? Number one, on that scenario. 2, on food. In that document, they're talking about importing food, also contacting the World Food Program. What will be the quick buffers as regards businesses? What can we do for businesses as we speak? Because we cannot afford to allow them go down. A business that has lost 100% in currency valuation of its business. That's why you see companies like MTN that were heralded for doing so well last 2-3 years are struggling today.
So I think the most important thing they can do is to provide stability in the economy, which I think this plan really seeks to address. We've already seen some stability already in the Naira. And again, that's a result of the increases in NPR. We have to give credit to Central Bank for that. Now, I think it's time for the fiscal side to really step up. So I think that's one point. I think also in that document, the minister had also pointed out some fiscal incentives by way of sort of removal of some taxes already, So they're considering removal or repeal of some sin taxes. There are a couple of other taxes that for beverages, sugar, Personally, I don't think that they need to go there. I think that what they can do, especially for SMEs represent the bulk of the businesses, operating in Nigeria. What they can do is perhaps in the medium term, or maybe the next year or two, reduce taxes. On top
income
of
tax.
income tax, corporate income taxes.
Corporate income tax.
Corporate income taxes. Yes, we've seen this happen in a number of other countries.
Today we're doing well over 30%.
30% is high
it's very
for
high.
a country that's trying to attract investment.
So you're saying we should knock down like 5% or thereabouts?
Yeah, I mean, somewhere in the 20s would be reasonable. But also very important is making sure that tax revenue is efficiently collected
so
and
should we
spent.
reduce corporate income tax and bump up VAT?
I'm not a proponent for increasing VAT. I think that this whole idea of trying to match VAT to what the global standards or average is doesn't make sense in a country like Nigeria, where the government is significantly underperforming in terms of what it needs to be doing to businesses and
this conversation
households.
that we have been having in the context of the Stabilization and Advancement Plan by the Ministry of Finance would as well be dismissed as speculative by the federal government of Nigeria, because there has been a statement by Mr. Bayo Ononuga saying that the inflation policy fiscal plan document that is out in circulation, and also the Stabilization and Advancement Plan, that they are not yet official policy documents, and that the media should be advised to refrain from discussing something that is not yet on the table. So all of these are conversations.
But why can't we discuss something that's not on the table?
Well, that's what they are saying.
I think it's very important for making or helping the president make a decision on this issue.
Okay. That's what they are saying.
I mean, everything that's been documented in this plan is not new. For example, we've talked about
what we have been doing is we're discussing leaked documents, but leave them with their own position. Eventually, when they have a plan, they will tell us. Some Nigerians are even concerned that 1 year after, the Tinubu administration is still talking about draft documents and no concrete plan about what they want to do with the economy. However, as somebody who has been observing the terrain, the space, the economic space, how do you think, in the context of this 1 year review of what the government has done, how do you think they fared with monetary policy and also with fiscal policy? And do you think that the ministers on both sides are doing well now that people are saying some ministers should be told to go back home because of their cluelessness? What do you
give me a bit of time on that. So I think on the monetary policy side, the central bank governor has done a lot. It came a bit later than he should have, and that led to quite a discrediting of the central bank and also the devaluation of the currency. But I think we're on the path to sort of correcting that now. What I advise that the central bank needs to continue to do is that they need to continue to increase interest rates. They need to move up even further, okay? 2 is that they need to continue to boost confidence by engaging all stakeholders. They also need to stop funding the federal government via ways and means, okay? That itself is a very, very important, approach to, forcing the government to adopt austerity measures. We can't continue this way. Like I already told you, we're well over 100 trillion naira in debt. Okay? So we're spending already more than, in 2023, it was about over 90% of government revenue on just servicing debt. Okay? So all this talk about, transfer programs and all of that, you can't even realize them because you don't have the money to do that. Okay, so if that also helps to address, or maybe before I get to, how I sort of look at performances of the ministers, maybe I should also speak about, fiscal policy. They need to adopt austerity measures. I want to see cuts in government spending, not increases in government spending. That is how we get out of this problem. Okay, Nigeria needs to adopt a medium to long-term development plan that puts Nigeria on where it needs to be. That articulates how the whole economy should function, SMEs, big organizations, individuals, homeless people, the vulnerable, etc. How does everybody fit in? How does that rise fit in into achieving or actualizing those plans? Okay, we need to do more around tax reforms. We need to broaden the base. Coming down to the issue of, the performance of the ministers, if I have to go by, Nigeria's economic performance in the last year, I think that my response to you would be they just haven't done well. Whether or not that's suggesting that, we need to perhaps rationalize the cabinet, I don't know. But I think that for me, this is going to Mr. President, is that something significant needs to be done as far as execution is concerned. If we're putting together a plan to accelerate development or to stabilize the economy, can we get that done as quickly as possible? The issues are very significant
just a quick response to Dr.
And dire.
Just a quick response to Dr. Bat before you come in. Ayo, please, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
All of that, I shudder in disbelief of what Mr. Bayo Ononuga replied. Because all the things you see in this plan were part of the official announcement President Tinubu made mid last year when he said he was holding subsidy price. He was giving money to small businesses, he was giving money to manufacturers, he was making over 150,000 hectares of. These were all the things that the president himself used his mouth to pronounce. Most of the things in this plan. So fair, I shudder in righteous disbelief at all of this.
Reforms, okay? The government have implemented reforms, okay? But my message is we need to see a lot more. Yeah. And I think that the finance minister has articulated that in his plan, but we need to see that plan, approved by the president and quickly implemented.
So implementation. At this stage, honestly, I don't think we should be speaking about drafts and plans. We should be seeing already implementations, honestly, at this stage. And I think that's why a number of people feel disappointed that this is what we're talking about in terms of just a draft, not even an actual plan or a plan that's been ratified.
I would say also bear in mind the realities, okay, of government funding.
Yeah, but
I've just told you that we're allocating more than 90% of government revenue already to funding servicing debt.
And give it
so I'm just trying to put that
I understand
some context so that you understand perhaps why.
It doesn't stop having a concrete plan, not a draft where you're even debating whether or not you should be looking at. I think it shouldn't stop that. And it should even be with consideration of our current realities in terms of.
If I had to make a recommendation, what I would say is that given the fiscal constraints, how do we get the private sector to be more involved? Why doesn't the government then focus perhaps on creating that enabling environment? Judicial reforms. A lot of people do not understand how.
$1 billion at 9% to large enterprises.
No, but
that's what Edgo is proposing.
No, but again, Doctor, let's be realistic here. Okay, so I know we can put numbers out there, but how can those numbers get to the companies or the individuals that they need to get to? We've just talked about 90% of government revenue going towards servicing debt. Yeah. And I assure you, possibly by the end of this year, it'll be 100%. So it means that government will be...
That's the question I wanted to ask you.
It means government...
2 years ago, saying that it was already over 100%.
It means government will essentially be running itself by just borrowing money.
Right.
But that's what we're doing.
Okay, so very quickly, I'm glad you talk about private sector and just providing an enabling environment because it's something we talked about. And I wanted you to speak to, we've had announcements of divestments, even foreign investors who are leaving the country, even though this government keeps maintaining the fact that this is an investment haven. I want you to speak to that. I'm not sure it was really captured in this, the plan.
Document?
Yes, with regards to what are the plans?
I think so. I think it did because I think
that businesses.
I think what the
number
document.
one second. It's also support local businesses. I know they talked a lot about MSMEs, but even the businesses that exist. What are the support mechanisms to ensure that business is more friendly? I know they talked about power, they talked about taxes. Yes, those are things to help. But we didn't. I don't know if the security should have been contained in this document in terms of because that's also a big issue. Even if we talk about food production as well.
You're right, and I'm just going to pick on security issue that you raised. Okay, Nigeria is still in the rankings of countries like Afghanistan, Somalia and places like that, as far as terrorism is concerned. A lot of people argue that perhaps since this administration took over last year that it's declined. I disagree. And in fact, I saw a report, I think over the weekend, suggesting that it is increased, which would make sense as far as
that's at variance with what the
food security and food output, the reality has been this year.
Yeah.
And so to your point, I think that a lot of work needs to be done. I even saw like a report by the CEO of a major agricultural company. You know, these guys produce palm oil. They're one of the largest producers of palm oil in Nigeria, and they're talking about how their rubber plantation was basically decimated by, you know, guys who just came in there. I mean, what are they called? You know, some of this.
The herdsmen.
The herdsmen, you know, that have been going around. And this is this year, by the way. So I think that they need to make a significant move on that. And you're right, I didn't see that in that plan, at least a detailed plan to tackle security issues. You know, it's like they kind of just sidestepped it.
Yeah, just moved away from it.
So I think that if we can see something on that front, it will also drive increased investment in Nigeria. Again, remember that all these policies are only just being pushed out now. It takes time for a lot of these companies to consider them and then begin bringing money into Nigeria. So consider this, or this is 2024, but I would say look at this as, say, 2002. Where reforms were only just beginning to trickle into the economy or just being announced, hadn't been implemented yet. But it didn't take us till 2004, 2005 before we began to see significant FDIs pouring into the country, FPIs as well.
In 2002.
We're coming from a low base. We're coming from a low base. Yeah, but I'm just saying that these things take time. Okay, but first of all, let's approve or agree on this. Yeah. You know, this plan, and then move very quickly to implementing it.
I want to thank you very much for joining us. And my big takeaway is that we have a right to make an input into their stabilization and advancement plan, so that the president doesn't go and sign an executive order and we'll come back and we'll say, no, they didn't listen to us. So the conversation should continue.
We do.
Because we are all stakeholders in this matter.
We do, but again, I'm going to emphasize, we need to do something about government revenue. Nigeria is currently averaging about 13% of its GDP, government revenue. Okay, you compare that to advanced countries that are somewhere around almost 40%. The Eurozone is about 45%. Sub-Saharan Africa is closer to 20%.
But perhaps as long as they focus more on productivity.
Yeah.
And make this economy a productive
As long as you boost output, okay, your taxes will increase.
Yeah, okay. So productivity, not just borrowing money and taxing innocent Nigerians like all of us on this table. Thank you very much.